Greetings, I am Craig Ellison. I am the agriculture agent and the county extension director in Northampton County of the North Carolina Cooperative Extension Service. Today I am standing in the plots of our replant decisions where we've got some gappy cotton stands, and we're going to have Guy Collins share some of the knowledge of things to consider when considering whether you need to replant or go with the stand that you've got. So welcome to our virtual CHROME Field Day, and we just hope you gain all kinds of knowledge for looking at the different plots we have.
Thank you for joining in on this virtual Field Day series. I'm Guy Collins. We can't be with you in person today, but I do wanted to show you some of the field work that we're doing all across North Carolina this year and last year. That myself and Dr. Keith Edmiston are conducting in collaboration with Dr. Jason Ward in Ag Engineering and his graduate student, Enrique Pena Martinez. And this has to do with redefining our replanting recommendations for cotton in North Carolina. So replanting in North Carolina, sadly, is not uncommon. It can be influenced by a large number of things, primarily weather. That comes to no surprise. In North Carolina, our planting season tends to be fairly challenging, whether that's prolonged spells of cool temperatures in the early spring or heavy packing rains that may influence emergence. Those are the most common factors. And they vary from year to year and even within a season. Now, over the past 2 years, we've seen quite a bit of difference in this weather behavior. 2019, for example, we had excellent planting conditions starting in very early May, which lasted most of our normal planting window with the exception of a few dry periods. In 2020, however, it was quite a bit different story. We started cold and wet, and we stayed that way essentially the entire planting season with the exception of a 5-day period right in the middle of May. But even once we got to acceptable temperatures, we had weeks even of heavy packing rains that negatively influenced emergence through most of our planting season. So in addition to that, there are some other factors that do play a role in the necessity for replanting and achieving an optimal stand. One is seed size. A lot of our current varieties vary fairly widely in terms of seed size, and a lot of our past research suggests that seed size is highly correlated to seedling vigor as long as warm and cool germ are at acceptable levels. Which brings me to my next point, seed quality. That's been a big issue over the past couple of years. Most of you are aware of that. I do want to remind you about the pilot program that NCDA has started back in 2020. This was a very successful program. We strongly encourage all producers to be checking their seed quality in that program and notifying NCDA if they don't see their lot number listed in that program, and an inspector will come out and collect a sample per their protocol. But seed quality strongly affects the necessity for replanting and successful stands. Seeding rates, and what I mean by this is the growers that tend to skimp on their seeding rates a little bit, trying to save a little money and push these seeding rates as low as they possibly can, oftentimes may encounter a replanting scenario a little more frequently than somebody that pays attention a little closer to their seeding rate and tries to plant an optimal rate for higher yields. Now, that does come into play with seed size and weather conditions as well. So naturally, a smaller seeded variety, we want to make sure we're planting that in warmer conditions and maybe plant it a little shallower. For example, larger seeded varieties, we could get by with a little bit lower seeding rate, and especially if it has a higher cool germ rating, we can feel a little bit better about planting those in somewhat marginal or adequate conditions. The time that we have to plant or replant, that does play a role. Our planting season in North Carolina is fairly narrow. Generally, we start somewhere around the end of April and that goes to the end of May, sometimes into the first week of June. But compared to other states, our window is fairly small. And the size and acreage of most of our growers now, we're forced to plant through some of these periods that may not be ideal for cotton planting. So that may just by default force us to plant in a scenario where we're more likely than not to have to replant. Now, currently, our recommendations are based off of some previous research conducted back in the early 2000s in Georgia and in Louisiana by some former cotton specialists there. And they developed a decision aid, and generally speaking, they concluded that 50% of the planted area occupied by 3-foot skips or greater at that point can generally necessitate replanting. So that's where our current recommendations are based on, and we want to evaluate that because there's been a lot of different changes that have occurred since this work has been done. One is changes in seed size. Modern varieties differ fairly widely in terms of seed size, but we have seen a trend where seed tend to appear to be getting a little bit smaller, especially in some of our more popular varieties. Yield potential has changed, which is a good thing. Yield potential tends to increase over time as new variety advancements are commercialized and new varieties come onto the market. Naturally, that plays into the equation in terms of cost of replanting and the rewards for doing so. The big change has occurred over the last 5 to 6 years. Used to, it would cost us really fuel and labor and wear and tear on equipment to plant or replant cotton. Prior to 5 or 6 years ago, most seed companies would just provide you with extra seed if you needed to replant. That changed a few years ago. Now most companies charge 25% of SRP, which is suggested retail price. And you add that to labor and fuel and wear and tear on equipment. This was surveyed to a few of our prominent growers. On average, that could cost you somewhere in the ballpark now of $35 an acre to replant cotton, which is quite expensive. So when you plug that into the equation, that really changes things. So we wanted to reevaluate our replanting recommendations for all of these reasons. So given all of these scenarios and what we commonly experience in North Carolina, skippy stands are not necessarily uncommon. It does vary from year to year and even within a season, and some other things like soil type do influence how frequently we encounter a skippy stand and whether or not we need to replant. A lot of these replanting decisions are really based on visual estimations of plant stands and therefore the skips within that plant stand. Really the only way to accurately assess a plant stand and therefore the size and frequency of these skips are through manual measurements, which are oftentimes very tedious. Most folks don't take the time to really do it because it takes quite a bit of time to accurately do it. So this is why we teamed up with Dr. Ward and his graduate student. These drones or UAVs offer a great opportunity for us to assess this with overhead imagery. So maybe we could do this in a much more timely manner. They are probably going to talk about that in another talk, so we're not going to dive too much into that for right now. We want to illustrate exactly what we're doing and why in this presentation here. But we do oftentimes notice two types of error when it comes to replanting amongst most growers. Naturally, those are the ones that replant when it's probably not necessary, and other growers may not replant when it probably is justified. So there are mistakes on both sides of this to be made, simply due to poor visual estimations on whether or not they need to replant. So as we mentioned earlier, cotton planting in North Carolina typically begins somewhere in late April or early May. Our first insurance cutoff is May 25th, And our final insurance cutoff is at the end of May. Beyond that, there is no insurance coverage. We have seen some cotton planted in that first week or so of June. Most of the time, it's generally accepted that cotton planted on or before May 25th should have about an equal chance to perform as good as cotton planted in late April or early May. Additionally, cotton planted between May 25th and on into the first week of June becomes a little more risky, a lot more erratic. But oftentimes, if a grower is a very timely manager and can be very timely with their inputs, especially insect sprays for like thrips and plant bugs, bollworms, stink bugs, etc., they can oftentimes pull it off. Maybe not with ideal yields or equal yields to that of early planted cotton, but somewhere within 80+% of that yield of early planted cotton. Now, in some years, your late planted cotton may yield greater than your early planted cotton. This could be the result of several reasons, primarily hurricanes or some kind of wet weather that occurs in September that causes a lot of hard lock and boll rot on early planted cotton. But late planted cotton may be unaffected because those bolls remain closed and protected, whereas a hurricane could knock out some lint from early planted cotton, for example. However, in other years, like what we saw in 2019, just seasonal rainfall and or drought can reward early planted cotton over late planted cotton. So we see that oftentimes too. So in this scenario, in our current research, we have both early and late planted trials. In the early planted trials, our treatments were planted right around the 1st of May, generally between April 29th and May 5th. And a replant treatment was planted on May 25th to simulate when, right before we would encounter our first insurance cutoff. Then we have our late planted trials where most of our treatments were planted right around our first insurance cutoff, so right around May 25th, with our replant treatment occurring on June the 5th, so right at the end of that first week of June. All right, so this is our 100% stand. Very loosely speaking, we generally advise somewhere around 43,500 seed per acre. This is 3 seed per foot on 36-inch rows. This is 100% stand. From there, which we mix seed, transgenic seed with conventional seed at various ratios. This is 75%. And then with 3 weeks in a row, we go in and apply Roundup and Liberty and to kill out the conventional plants. And what we're trying to simulate here is, or trying to create, is natural random skips in terms of size and frequency. Okay, similar to what you would encounter in a real world situation. So you want to focus on the blue seed here. Those are the ones that we want to keep and the ones that we want to emerge. So this is a 75% stand. Now we have a 50% stand and a 25% stand. You can see we're getting fairly thin here. And then lastly, a 10% stand. Okay, so naturally this would be a replant scenario in most cases. All right, so you heard me mention our collaboration with Dr. Jason Ward and his graduate student, Enrique Martinez. So they were kind enough to collaborate with us and take some overhead imagery using UAVs. I'm not going to get too much into that because they're probably going to talk about that in a separate presentation. But this is just an overhead shot of some of these treatments. This is your 100% stand that we have highlighted here. Then your 75% stand. Now your 50% stand. Then your 25% stand. You can see fairly is thin, and we have a fairly high frequency of 3-foot skips or greater. And then you have your replant treatments, which is naturally younger cotton. So remember, the early planted trials were planted in early April and replanted on May 25th. Your late planted trials, they were planted around May 25th with a replant treatment around June the 5th. And that matches closely what we see growers doing across the state.